From our studios in Cuenca, Spain, I'm Kate Jetmore with The Listen, exploring the subtleties of culture and compassion in every conversation. We're thrilled to bring you the third and final conversation in our Season 19 series focusing on activism. In today's interview, we'll be talking about the flow of migrants from Northern Africa into the EU, the lawlessness that governs our oceans, and the thin line between civilization and barbarity. My guest today is Ian Urbina, an investigative reporter based in Washington. His most recent series, The Outlaw Ocean, chronicles a diversity of crimes offshore, including the killing of stowaways, sea slavery, intentional dumping, illegal fishing, the stealing of ships, gun running, stranding of crews, and murder with impunity. He has reported from Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, and the Middle East, much of that time spent on fishing ships. Welcome, Ian. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin with the article you wrote for the December 6th issue of The New Yorker. You focus in that article on the plight of a young man named Aliyu Khande. What can you share about his story?
Aliyu was a quintessential climate migrant, a young man of 28 years from West African nation of Guinea-Bissau, a father, a farmer, husband, kind of hitting desperate times, largely because his farm could no longer produce, and decided to leave home and make a route that many refugees and migrants do, hoping to get to Europe. He had a brother in Italy and Spain, and figured he might be able to buy his way onto a trafficker's raft across the Mediterranean. But first he needed to get through the Saharan desert and likely into Libya, which is the most common launching point. So he made that route, and ultimately he was killed in a prison in Libya after being captured at sea.
Yeah, there's a scene you describe in the article about a terrible fight that breaks out in the Libyan prison where Aliyu was being kept. And apparently, as that scuffle was breaking out, incredibly violent scuffle, he said to his friend, who was also being held, "I'm not going to fight. I'm the hope of my entire family." How representative would you say his words are of other migrants trying to get to Europe?
I think the vast majority of migrants, whether you define them as climate migrants or economic migrants or just simply migrants, typically leave home because they're trying to find a better life. And I don't know, actually, of many stories that don't fit that category. So I think Aliyu's perspective that, he was really trying to stay alive so that he could get someplace, not because he wanted to go there per se, but because that might allow him to access a wage and finances that he could then send home to support his family. That, I think, is almost universal for so many of these migrants.
Mm-hmm. Do you happen to know what happened to his family? Didn't he have a young son and maybe a pregnant wife?
He did. When he left, his wife was pregnant. He had 2 kids already. He had 2 brothers. His parents were still alive. I kept, this investigation took upwards of a year to produce. And so I sort of was in almost daily contact with one brother in particular, the one who was back in Guinea-Bissau. And I've stayed in touch with him. The family, is struggling pretty severely. The wife was, after Aliyu's death, really devastated and had a tough time moving on. In that culture, she needed to finish her mourning so as to be able to marry anew. And in her culture, she needed to marry, if only for the sake of breadwinning, And so the farm wasn't producing enough produce and to feed the family. And now her one main breadwinner was gone. So pretty dire situation. The brothers, Aliyu's 2 brothers, the one in Italy and the other in Spain, have continued to send money back home and are essentially keeping Aliyu's children, his wife, and Aliyu's parents afloat financially.
Mm-hmm. So it really does come down to the ones who've reached Europe.
Yeah, you start seeing, on the one hand, this is an insanely perilous journey. if you even make it through the sort of gauntlet that is the Sahara, where there are terrorist groups and militias and traffickers and assorted other abusers, and you arrive to Libya, now you've reached the center of hell. And it's any man's guess whether you ever make it out of Libya. And then if you're lucky enough to make it out of Libya, you're then in a human trafficker's boat crossing the Mediterranean, usually a boat meant for 50 people carrying 500. So it's just layers upon layers of peril to get to this other place, namely Europe, where then you're undocumented and you're hoping to find a job. So it's a pretty brutal path to follow, and people don't take it on a whim.
Right. Right. That's an important thing to remember. The sense that I got from your article is that this terrible and uncertain journey that has been, it was already complicated before. It seems like it's getting worse. I mean, what you've described in Libya seems like something fairly new. Is it?
So what's not new is migration and this specific route of migration. That's been a norm for almost a century. In the last 50 years, it was fairly brutal but regulated. And those that traveled through the Sahara and went to Libya to launch to Europe had to go through Gaddafi's Libya, and so this was a police state, and it was pretty scary, and there were prisons, etc., but it was regulated. Then Libya, Gaddafi was toppled. Libya became this kind of failed state. It's a war zone in the south and divided between two governments in the north. And so it became a free-for-all in terms of the trafficking industry. More desperation due to Middle Eastern wars, Syrian, Afghani refugees, and then a lot of sub-Saharan climate migrants all began flowing through this pipeline. What is hugely different is the invisible wall that essentially has been erected across the Mediterranean, a de facto wall paid for and constructed, again, metaphorically speaking, here by the EU. And that wall is meant to block migrants from reaching European shores, especially Greece, Malta, Italy, Spain. And that wall consists not of bricks, but of enforcement. And that enforcement is the Libyan Coast Guard, which is a proxy force that is paid for by the EU to stop migrants from making it across. And then in the air, you have drones and airplanes paid for by the EU called Frontex, and they're spotting the migrant boats and capturing them that way. And then on land, if you're thinking of this almost as a war on migration, the army, if you will, is the militias that run the detention centers where all these migrants are taken. Those are armed forces, brutal places, and very well organized and largely EU supported.
In the article, you mention a formal agreement which has the EU equipping this group that calls themselves the Libyan Coast Guard in an effort to stem the flow of migrants from Northern Africa. I can imagine that politically the EU is defending its stance by saying, we're funding efforts to keep people in their own countries, rather than we're funding efforts to keep them from coming into our countries. But it really seems like what the EU is doing is making matters worse. Do you think they're doing more harm than good here?
It depends on your goals. If the goal is to stop people from reaching your land, then the effort has been wildly successful. The numbers have dropped off a cliff, the numbers of arrivals. If your goal is to comply with international law, if your goal is humanitarian concern for humans, whatever their nation, if your goal is to come up with a sustainable policy to deal with what will increase as the flow of climate migrants, if those are your goals, then this has been a disaster. And the policy of the EU of funding the Libyan Coast Guard ostensibly, so supposedly, is for rescues. The rhetoric around the mission of that funding is first and foremost to help those migrants to avoid drowning on the Mediterranean or being taken advantage of by human traffickers. Well, that's malarkey. The truth of the matter, that funding is for migration control, and its real purpose is to stop the migrants from arriving And these are not rescues. First of all, the migrants do not want to be rescued. Second of all, they're in international waters, not national waters. And third of all, they're being rescued, air quotes here, to be returned to a place that the UN and the EU describes as a war zone and where crimes against humanity. So that's not humanitarian work. That's not doing right by the migrants. That's doing right by Europe. So I think the first thing that has to happen is let's call things what they actually are. Those are arrests, not rescues, and they're for Europe, not for the migrants. Okay, now if we have an honest reckoning, is there ethics even within that policy? Well, that's a live debate. Should countries be able to control their borders and limit who comes in? Yes. Is this a sustainable way to do it? And is outsourcing migration control to failed states like the US does in Mexico or Italy does in Libya a sustainable and ethical solution? No. And I think those are the really that's a more sober, honest conversation to have.
Right. And how does the EU defend itself at the moment? Are they clinging to that word that you said, which is rescue? These are rescues?
They do a bunch of things. They being, if the spokesperson for the European Commission, which is the governing body of the European Union, were here now, here's what I would imagine he or she would say. Number one, we're rescuing, we're helping the migrants, we're making sure they don't get taken. Okay. Number two, we are not to be held, argument two, we are not to be held accountable for the brutalities that happen on land in Libya. That's Libya's fault. And those prisons, we don't run them, we don't pay for the guns or the uniforms, and it's not our fault that bad stuff happens there. That's also disingenuous and deeply dishonest. And number three, we are attempting to slow migration down because we can't and shouldn't have to deal with all these desperate people coming to our shores. Okay, let's take number two and number three. Number two is disingenuous because it's this siloing of we only deliver them. What happens after that isn't our fault. Well, look, if I were to pay a guy if I were to drive a guy to a bank knowing that he was going to rob the bank and we got caught, I would be an accomplice to a crime and I'd be charged and convicted. Okay, just that you're driving them there doesn't mean that you're not part of the bank robbery. Similarly, the EU knows full well that the Libyan Coast Guard is delivering the migrants to places of harm, and they're still doing it. So they are accomplices to those places of harm. And then the notion that the third argument, that they are helping to control their borders in a way that is fair. Okay, there is a little bit of merit there in my personal view. The larger concern, though, is controlling your borders and relying on places that are lawless and not complying with your laws, essentially using a proxy force to do things you don't want to do, like the U.S. government was doing with rendition. Lots of governments do it all the time. Yes, this is a proxy setup, and it's a way for you to get around your own human rights and labor laws, etc. So I think those are the problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ian, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back to continue our conversation. My guest is investigative reporter Ian Urbina. Back in a second. If you like what you hear on The Listen, why not check out our personal interview services? We'll help you record your favorite stories, honor your loved ones, and capture special memories before they fade. It's the perfect gift for grandchildren, parents, and partners. For more information, check out our website at thelistenpodcast.com. This is Kate Jetmore with The Listen. If you're just joining us, my guest is journalist Ian Urbina. I'd like to turn now to the nonprofit you started called the Outlaw Ocean Project. What is the Outlaw Ocean Project, and what gap were you hoping to fill when you started it?
The Outlaw Ocean Project is a small nonprofit journalism organization. We're a news organization, not an advocacy organization. We produce stories. I spent 17 years at the New York Times and wanted to continue focusing on a certain category of stories, namely those broadly defined as the Outlaw Ocean, which is really stories that pertain to human rights, labor, and environmental concerns at sea anywhere in the world. So that, 2/3 of the planet is water, and there's a lot, more than 50 million people work out there. So there's a lot of amazing stories to be told in that realm, and I wanted to focus on that. The other thing I wanted to do, and that we do now at this nonprofit, is I wanted to disseminate the stories in more creative and daring different ways. So I wanted, if we were going to spend a year producing a story about Libya or North Korea, and we were going to get it published in an outlet, maybe it's the Washington Post or the BBC or the Economist or the New Yorker, we wanted to change the rules of engagement and say that those venues would not be allowed exclusivity. So if we want more people in the world, more different people in the world to consume that in other languages and younger people, etc., then we would have to break that rule where content was locked down in one outlet. And so we sort of self-fund our own stories so that we own them fully, and then we translate all of them into 8 languages, and then we find partners in dozens of different countries that want to run it for free, and that gets a much bigger audience for the content. And then the third thing we do is we also try to convert the stories into other mediums. Often that involves collaborating with artists, be they stage theater or musicians or animators or muralists, and we try to think of interesting ways to take the stories and work with an artist to give them a different sort of voice.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? I wanted to ask you about your collaboration with animators, artists, muralists, as you said, in an effort to reach different audiences. Can you talk in a little bit more detail about some projects that you've been involved with there?
Yeah, I mean, the core and perhaps simplistic notion that I've had is that I think that artists are more adept storytellers, more adept in the specific sense of accessing emotion. Even if I was a better writer than I am, and even if I had the very best videographer with me at all times, there's still limits to our medium. And you're entering people, your consumer of the story, through their eyes, through their head. And I thought, well, what if we try to enter people in different ways, through their ears with music, or through their eyes, but down to their heart first, really try to touch people in the way that art does much better than words do. And so on the broadest level, that was the thought. The other thought was oftentimes these different art forms, podcast or radio in general, or murals or music, take their content and they situate them on platforms that are not the ones where I live. So it's not the New York Times website, it's Spotify, right? And so then I started thinking, well, how can I get younger demographic, like my 18-year-old son, but in Taiwan and Caracas and Reykjavik, to consume these stories? One way might be to go to these alternate platforms, like music platforms or YouTube or TikTok or whatever, and team up with people who know how to put content on those platforms in different ways, and use that other content almost like an appetizer to the full meal. So the art rendering is a shorter, different rendering that hopefully grabs the attention of the consumer, and they say, that's interesting, what's that about? Let me learn more. And then they click over and they read the full story. So that's kind of what we do with music and with mural art, and it has worked. We get a lot of people that probably would never have found us coming to us because they discovered a piece of art that's connected to our reporting.
And how literal is that art? I mean, is the art is it figurative and sort of representative of the story that's behind it? Or is it just, is it more abstract? I'm curious about what that looks like.
So the music project, the Outlaw Music Project, was the biggest first experiment in this regard. And we have over, 450 musicians from 60 countries making albums in classical and hip hop and electronic. And figuring out some of these questions, like how literal should we ask the artist to be, was the learning process. And what we said was, let's leave it up to the artist. The literal end is, hey, Mr. Musician or Miss Musician, here is an archive of sounds. Those sounds are ambient, meaning they come from the reporting themselves. They might be key moments like machine gun fire in Somalia or chanting deckhands on the South China Sea, really textured ingredients. If you'd like to use them, please do. And that will make the music really rich, authentic, textured. if you want to go, that's the non-literal. If you want to go the other direction and get literal, here's also sounds with interviews and readings of chapters and parts of stories that have words. And if you want to integrate those too, you can. If you want to use none of them, that's fine too. And sort of make it, so it's really up to you. We do just genuinely ask you to read the content and not just, make music that doesn't have any true connection with the reporting. We want you to be inspired, but how you're inspired and how you connect it, we leave it up to you.
And who are these artists? I mean, do you seek them out? Do they seek you out?
Varies. In the beginning, I started with my own Spotify playlist. I have it open here now, and I reached out to people that I listen to, and just pitched them on the idea. It's a fairly charitable request I'm making of them because there's not real great monetization. There's not a lot of money, if any, for them to make on this. They have to be sort of inspired by the concept of helping support the journalism. And that's ultimately what this is about, is primarily asking them to help us. But we would pitch them, and we still do, and describe what we're aiming to do, the pros and cons. And then if they want to come on board, then they come on board and they make the album, and then we publish it. We do the album art and the video and all that stuff. Then word got out, and we started getting, approached by artists who had heard from other musicians about this thing, and they were interested. And so now we get, 2 or 3 inquiries per week from artists, some really tiny and some much larger, that are interested in possibly joining the project.
Interesting. Well, I'd like to check more of that out. To go back to the founding of the project, I'm curious why you were drawn to the sea as a focal point. Was it because of your sort of upbringing? I mean, were you brought up with boats and things like that? Or was it more to do with your work and how your work has unfolded in your professional life?
Really the latter. I mean, I didn't grow up sailing or spending any real time on the water other than visiting the beach every summer. And I was sort of enamored with the beach, but I didn't really have a relationship with the ocean per se. I was an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, before I became a journalist, and sort of that's relevant because what attracted me to cultural anthropology was a desire to go to far off places and see truly foreign things, a desire to sort of explore otherworldly places, that were very different from my reality. And the sort of world of seafarers, this transient diaspora tribe of people grabbed me. I dabbled in that realm as an anthropologist a little bit in grad school, and then I had to switch topics. But then when I got to journalism and at the New York Times, I always harbored this fantasy that wouldn't it be amazing if I could double back and just do a series about that world and those people. And I finally found the editor that greenlit that very idea, and off we went. And then I couldn't put it down. I became enamored, not just with the people, but also having spent 5 years out there reporting, I became hooked on the space, both the seedy, dark, brutal underside, and it's just sheer awe and beauty and, force as well.
One thing that, it just seems so obvious to say this out loud, but the thing about the ocean, not to be trite, but the thing about the ocean is that it's deadly for human beings. I mean, we can't survive there without the right equipment and a lot of support. And yet there's so much of it on the planet. And it calls out to so many people, starting with you.
Yeah.
So what is that? I mean, what is it about the ocean that would make us want to go there, knowing that it could be, we might not come home again?
Moth to a flame, right? Moth gets too close, it gets burnt. But there's this weird instinctive magnetism of some sort that that seems to exist. I think there is a similar moth to a flame dynamic between humans and their relationship to the sea that I don't fully understand. I've never seen anyone explain it well, but it's real. I try in the book to sort of nibble at things that might explain the gravitational pull, this metaphor for freedom, the openness, the sort of sense of virginity and untouched, space that feels, I don't know, it feels different and it feels free. I do think that to your first point, it's exactly the altitude I like to think about when pondering this realm. It is a space that both attracts us but is deadly, and we're not built for it. We're land creatures at the end of the day, and yet so many of us want to go out there. I think that conjures up for me a comparison to space travel, in the sense that it is this weirdly alluring and scary place that people want to go to, if only for the sake of traveling through it, because it seems to have a power and difference, and it does. Then you get out there and you're like, oh wow, like time, you spend enough time out there, and your relationship with time, your relationship with light, your relationship with gravity, I mean, literally these things, your very biology changes. And when you experience those things, you're hooked. I mean, you might come back to shore and think, whoa, that was like dropping acid, in space or something. It was a mind-altering experience. I'm not sure I want to do that again. Or you might say, I don't think I can ever not do that again. You could be one of the two, but I clearly was the latter.
Right. Well, there are so many great stories on your website, and I encourage everyone out there to explore your website. I want to talk about one story that's called "Saving the Planet While Ignoring 2/3 of It." Given the fact that the climate crisis is on everyone's radar every single day, as it should be, it's really striking to hear it put this way. Do you think that's true? Do you think that efforts to combat climate change are failing to take our oceans into consideration?
Not entirely. I mean, obviously you're a writer, and so you're prone to hyperbole just to grab attention, and I did that there a little bit. But I do think generally that I do stand by that point, that considering the sheer proportionality of the space, so 2/3 of the surface, considering the number of people that work out there, considering the role that space has in the organism that is the planet, 50% of the air we breathe, is produced by the oceans. Considering all these things, one would think from the point of view of proportionality, when it comes to dollars and man hours or minutes in the day and just sheer publicity attention, there would be a much higher percentage of attention being paid on, hey, how's the ocean going to help us solve this crisis? Or what are we doing on the oceans that are helping worsen the crisis? And that proportionality is not there. Like, you rarely hear those discussions happening. And that's largely why we created our journalism organization, because it gets back to the core issue of journalism in general about this space is rare. And therefore policy discussion and litigation and think tank pondering and all these, and artistic output and innovation and entrepreneurialism, all these things, these engines of ideas and change, are not as present out there.
Do you think it comes back to the prior point, which is that the ocean, we're not made for the ocean? So there's sort of a part of our brain that's like, well, I just won't think about that. I could never live there. And many people never go there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, industry and governments and humans reside on land. The rules being written are in meetings that are on land, not on ships. And, the amount of activity happening on land means that there's a sort of skewing towards thinking about the planet from a land-based perspective. I also think, though, that when you look at the history of how the ocean is handled, and you look at things like commerce, right? It's actually commerce, globalized economy, the travel of goods, 90% of what we consume comes by way of ship, not because it's faster. And even if it was more expensive, it probably still would, largely because there's a lot fewer border guards. It's international water. It's much less regulated, and therefore things can flow easy. And that gets back to not just the metaphor of freedom, but the reality legally of freedom on the high seas has created the oceans as this hands-off place. Okay, like the instinct is less regulation. You have to justify why you would put rules on that space because it's de facto is freedom. On land, it's someone's land. It's not the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. Every piece of land is some nations, and the de facto is, well, there are rules there, and if you're going to change them, you need. So I do think that gets to a little bit of why the very core of the ocean space, especially the high seas, is woefully overlooked because it was almost built to be left alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's take another short break and we'll be right back to talk more with my guest, investigative reporter Ian Urbina. If you're enjoying this episode, check out our Season 5 conversations on adventure or our Season 11 series on the opioid crisis. You can explore our full archive by following us on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify. There are dozens of interviews waiting for you there, all free and easy to access. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and be sure to join our Facebook group, the Listen Podcast Community. And if you'd like to make a donation to the show or pitch a guest, you can do so through our website at thelistenpodcast.com. We're talking today with Ian Urbina about his experiences as an investigative reporter. Ian, before we continue, why don't you let our listeners know where they can find you and how they can support the Outlaw Ocean Project? And we'll be sure to include those links in our show notes as well.
Well, thanks for that. I can be found on our website. The organization's website is theoutlawocean.com. And, my email is there. It's ian@theoutlawocean.com. And we are supported by small donors who think that this journalism is worthy. And there's a donation button on the website.
Okay, great. Well, I encourage people to check it out. It's great work that you're doing. I've heard you talk about the ocean. Well, you just said this right before the break, the ocean as a lawless space, a sort of Wild West. Do you think there's any chance that this dynamic would ever change?
I do. I mean, I think that it's changing all the time, so, and there's one clarification I would hasten to make, which is that there are actually a lot of rules and laws and agreements written about the ocean. What is distinct is the lack of enforcement, and that gets you into the high seas and international nature of it. It also just gets into the economics of sprawl. It's such a huge space, and other issues like the victims of crimes in that space are typically people or entities like sea creatures that don't have a lobby. So fish are not cuddly like the koala, or the elephant, and they don't make for great icons of movements and therefore lobbies to protect. After all, the marine life there is typically known as seafood. It's not a creature name, it's a consumption name. And I do think that that contributes to why less enforcement, why there isn't more enforcement. I think that things are changing all the time. For example, technology is such that you can now, if the price point and political will are there, see every square inch of the ocean, because of satellites and big data and algorithmic, kind of open source technology and all sorts of other gizmos that exist now could allow for the presence of traffic to be in that space, to be handled not unlike post 9/11 air traffic is handled. Planes flying from A to B, you need to know who's on them, what cargo they're carrying, where they're going, when they're going to land. Fishing vessels and merchant marine don't typically have that sort of oversight and tracking. And they've gotten away with it culturally and legally for a long time. But now the technology is there that the public could exert that sort of oversight. So I do think that's one example where once you see what folks are doing, then you can probably do things about it.
Right. It seems like it sort of comes down to value. What value do we put on those ships? What value do we put on the human beings that are on them? Because when you think about, an airplane that's going from from New York City to London, for example. There are 300 human beings, from the first world who are on that plane. And our society puts a higher value on those lives than on, a bunch of people on some vessel in the South China Sea, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, you're 100% right. To echo your point, the insurance rates on the goods exceeds the insurance rates on the humans. There is no insurance for deckhands most often. There is heavy insurance on the shrimp on board. So something happens, the cod, the shrimp, the tuna gets damaged, there's a price to pay. A guy loses his arm, he's probably not even going to get those bills covered.
Wow.
So you see the value of the things on the vessel.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that humanity and humanitarianism are at the heart of your work. And that's what I saw. That's what I got from your New Yorker article. That's what I got from, exploring your website a little bit. And it's certainly what I'm getting from this conversation. If it's not too personal a question, I'd love to know how you maintain your balance, how you maintain your physical health and your mental health in the presence of situations that are so often hopeless.
Well, I mean, it's an open question whether I do. But let's, for the sake of discussion, assume I'm decently sound mind and mentally healthy. I don't know. I mean, it's easier to answer specifically with regard to reporting trips, where both they're physically grueling, emotionally, mental health wise grueling, and you really got to keep an eye on that, or I do, because I can just go and stay in the field too long, stay exposed to really dark stuff too long, and it can push me past a limit, and then that's problematic. And I've had a couple of times where I've gone past that line, and I've in retrospect realized it and tried to learn what the warning signs are and how preemptively to do things just to maintain myself, whether I'm on a ship. I'm talking about little things like you're going to spend a month at sea. You structure your time. I structure my time in a really regimented way, get up at the same time every day, follow certain rituals, work out every morning, spend only X amount of time writing, X amount of time reporting, Y amount of time staring out into space, listening to music, really. And even when I want to kind of drift from that, I stay to it, especially when at sea, or especially when I'm in reporting places where I'm seeing a lot of dark stuff, because those little things help keep me somewhat moored emotionally. I think that one of the hardest things, and I still haven't cracked the code on how best to manage this stuff, is the emotional after effect of these trips when I come back to a fairly endowed existence, first world, live in Washington, D.C., solidly middle class, warm home, happy family, and I'm coming from places where that's not what I'm seeing, to put it mildly. And the sense of guilt at that disparity, kind of on a global level that we all grapple with of, these two things are happening simultaneous to each other, and how is that fair? And managing those dark hauntings, I try to channel them into, okay, that's really messed up and that really haunts me. I'm not going to solve that, myself, but I could, in my own way, channel that into working that much harder on the piece I'm working on so that it is that much better. And maybe that the quality of that journalism will have in a small way an impact on those individuals, but also the larger disparity problems. Maybe, and I try to believe that that's true, because that's how I try to channel it.
Mm-hmm. What about for other people who, aren't journalists and aren't in the field and aren't coming back and writing articles? What can you say to people out there who are, aware and concerned and want to contribute, want to help? What do you think? How do you think people can help?
Well, I would just ask help with the kinds of things that, the myriad problems within the Outlaw Ocean. Yeah, I guess I guess my answer is we're all just little people who don't have a huge amount of power in and of ourselves, but we do have probably more power than we think of. And the first way to ponder that is, okay, let me make sure that I don't get jaded and dismissive that I can't do anything, so I'm going to do nothing. And I'm going to lean into my luxurious, self-absorbed life. Be careful of that gravitational force. And then on the other side, let me also be careful of the opposite force, which is I need to spend all my time, because this place is so messed up and I need to fix it myself. And then you get demoralized and eaten alive. So you try to course the path in between them. And then I try to say, okay, even if you're looking at what I report on, you think, okay, there's a war out there and the war is meta and it's against bad stuff happening. And then within that war, there are lots of battles. And whether the war is winnable or not, I say don't even try to answer that question. Just don't try to engage with notions of the war. The war probably is not winnable and you probably can't even get up there and fight on that level. But think about the individual battles. So in my realm, I think, okay, if your issue is ocean plastic or murder with impunity or sea slavery or overfishing, or choose things that really speak to you, make them manageable, focus your attention on those things, and then think of yourself in the variety of different ways you are. You're a taxpayer, you're an interlocutor, you talk with your kids, your spouse, your friends, you're a voter, you're a donor, you can give small amounts of money to stuff you believe in, you're a letter writer, there are lots of different capacities that you operate in, you're a buyer of stuff. So think of all the different capacities, and in those small places, put a little effort in, towards your goal across all those silos. To me, that actually adds up. One person can have an impact on one issue, especially if they work in a multilateral way, all the different ways that they talk about it, vote a certain way, make a small donation, write a letter, join, throw some hours at some cause, inform yourself so you become fluent on the issue and you can educate the people around you. All these things help.
Right. They're like drops in a bucket, and ultimately the bucket fills up. Well, Ian, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Your cause is very important, and I'm happy to be able to help you get your voice heard. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
This concludes our Season 19 series on activism. Many thanks to Athina Lambrinidou, Arwa Damon, and Ian Urbina for their generous contributions. The Listen podcast is produced and recorded in Cuenca, Spain, known by the ancient Romans as Conca. I want to thank Lisa Dahl, our web guru, and Julie Haley, who handles our social media. And many thanks to our technical team, John Jetmore and Lucas Munoz Jetmore, who make sure the show is ready to go each week. I'm Kate Jetmore, and this is The Listen.